Over the years, there are many times that I wanted to leave the kids' death. This is Truth So Raw, and I am your host, Lenora Wolf. I remember early on, I had gotten pregnant. I had been told I couldn't get pregnant. And I had morning sickness really bad. He wanted to go fishing. And we drove all the way to Homer. Well, there I got about a morning sickness the next morning. And he was really unhappy because he had to go fishing alone, and I lay in the truck all day throwing up. I even went to a doctor. He got upset about that. And on the way back, I'm laying in the seat. I wanted to stay there because I was too sick to ride all the way home. And he picks up a hitchhiker and makes me sit up. And it was pretty much there that I became disconnected from him. It was right there. I just didn't feel like he showed me any empathy. There were so many instances where I think back on, like, I saw myself as a flirt. The only experience I had was my dad was always flirting with the young sisters in the hall. But looking back, I remembered all these times that he would take off, go fishing, take off, go flying. And even when I went into labor with my daughter, she was our third child, I couldn't hardly get him to come back to be there with me while I was in labor, because he was doing his solo flight lesson, and that's what he wanted to do. So over the years, it was always a case of him taking every opportunity to be gone, and me being at home raising the kids. In the beginning, for years and years, when they ran their own construction business, he would work 7 days a week. Anything, he would just be gone. Most of the time at home at night, but be gone. And I had one friend in Alaska, and then I had my sister who came and stayed with me for long periods of time, and all the time that I remember, I was always with them. I was never with him. So I just became more and more disconnected from him. But I was uneducated. The only job I had had from the time I was 6 years old was in a janitor business. I had taken a GED. And there were several times I tried to leave over the years. So when he made the decision on the mountain to go to Barrow, I was livid, but that was another thing. He was extremely laid back until you pushed him too far. And I had learned to be extremely laid back, and we didn't start fighting until he made the executive decision to go to Barrow. And the fights got worse and worse because he would go and he'd be gone for weeks at a time, and he'd leave me, he'd abandon me on that mountain with 4 little kids. On the mountain, I knew nobody. The only time I was around somebody was when we were in Washington and I had my sister. But on that mountain, I knew nobody, and I was always, for weeks at a time, me and the kids. That's all there was. I loved my kids. My kids were my world. I was married to him for years and years. I always saw that they were my kids. They weren't his because he wanted to leave every opportunity he got. They were my kids. I had written a book, and in Barrow I had learned about how to use a computer. AOL had just come around, and I was going into chat rooms with other authors. And this guy comes trolling in. Well, I didn't know anything about trolling. And he was very flirtatious. And over the years, when I realize now, when I would become flirtatious, somebody was paying attention to me. Somebody was actually paying attention to me. I spent so much time alone, me and my kids, and I loved that. But I had this side that was very lonely, and somebody was paying attention. Well, the fights between me and my husband had gotten worse and worse, and I had remembered 2 instances where he actually got frustrated enough with me that he choked me out. And one of those times, I was surprised when I woke up alive. I woke up on the bed, and I was surprised I was alive. What I didn't realize until many years later, when the kids started really coming at me about stuff, was that my youngest son witnessed one of those times. I didn't find that out until over 30 years later. And the fights got worse, and another time he threw a can at me and put a huge purple bruise on my thigh. And then his brother was flirting with me at one point, and we were out there in the dark talking on the land. And he came out and grabbed me by the hair and dragged me into the house across the ground by the hair. And he was not violent until he was. And we were having more and more problems with alcohol. He was drinking too much, and what I remember about this, because I thought because my son brought it up, was that he was drinking more and more, and I knew as witnesses we weren't supposed to be drinking, and the guilt was really getting to me, and I kept bugging him more and more, and he had just bought alcohol, and I don't remember what the fight was about, but I do remember that it had nothing to do with, we hadn't reached the point where I got on AOL. And my son seemed to think that that's what it was about. That's not what it was about. It was about the alcohol and whatever else was bugging me about Barrow. And he actually stopped the van in the middle of the road, went around and threw me out on the ground, and went on up. And then when my sister came by, and I sat on the tailgate and got a ride up there, and when I got there, he was marching around with a rifle over his shoulder. So I snuck up, and I told the kids to go to their Aunt Deb's, and the 2 older ones, their dads usually laid back. They didn't pay any attention to that. And the next thing I knew, I had snuck into the van, and he appeared at the window with a pistol in his hand. And he was screaming at me, and he kept waving it from my head to his head, my head to his head, my head to his head. And I thought I was dead. I just sat there, and I was like, this was it. And then finally he stepped back, and he shot out one of the tires and walked around and shot out the second one, the third one, the fourth one. and something inside me snapped. I had reached the point that I wanted to leave. And I had even said to him that I would rather go and be a hooker, which was totally not in me, than to stay. I didn't have a way to leave. And I think in the back of my mind that the only way I saw was if somebody else helped me, and that's going from one guy to the next guy. And I look back over the years and I'm like, what was that young woman thinking? But I can see the desperation. I was suffocating. I felt 3/4 dead, and I wanted to leave. And when he got frustrated enough, he turned to violence. Well, it was after this that I was talking to this guy, like we'll call him Mac, because that's what his name was online years ago. He had hooked me up with Snow. And she seemed to think that I was in a far more dangerous situation than she was, and she was being beaten to the point that she had sealed records in the hospital. We were supposed to go and meet and be in this big city where we could disappear. He had told me over the years that if I left and went with anybody, he would kill me. And I believed him. And so right around the time, right before I left, there was this family the kids played with, and they were out having a barbecue, and the kids were all up in the attic watching their parents, and she started flirting with this guy and sat on his lap, and he went in and got a gun and he fired at them, and they were running, and she tripped and fell over a root, and he thought he killed her, and he killed himself, and the kids are watching. And again, this gun incident, it snapped something inside me. The choking didn't for some reason, but the gun incident did. And I was like, I am not becoming another statistic. Where my fear had kept me paralyzed over the years, because I tried to leave in California too. It was gone. We had even reached a point where we were getting along when we first built that cabin. So when I went back to the mountain, the only job I could get was at the little gas station, and it was very minimal back then what I could make, and all that told me was that I would never be able to support my kids, because I had no education and no background like he did. So I felt trapped. Things kept being I kept being forced to go down roads I didn't want to go. And I kept being forced into situations I didn't want to be in. And I knew I needed to go. I was suffocating, but I didn't know how I could go. And I guess in the back of my mind, in that young woman's mind, the only thing that was left to me was to go from one person to another. But in my education, growing up in the hall, men provided and women raised kids. So that wasn't, it blows my mind now, but that wasn't an unusual, I guess, way to think back then. So when my middle son had this conversation with me, because what happened was, over the years, this is what people do. I'm not saying that he was deliberately trying to poison my kids against me, but he wanted them to understand his side, and in his mind, I was just the wife that who was supposed to be good with her husband's decisions, and I was the wife who didn't adhere to his decisions, and I kept being this little flirtatious little woman who wasn't a good wife. And this is the picture that my kids, they were very angry with me. I went through one who was angry and had alcoholism, like severely alcoholic, and for many times he raged at me over and over and over again that I had left his dad and I had left the mountain, and I had all this guilt because I had been raised a witness and you don't get a divorce no matter what, and then I had gone from the frying pan into the fire with who I went to. So in their mind, I was this, my son called me an AWOL whore. And then many years later, when I thought that I had healed my family, my other son was like, in their dad's mind, he painted it as, yeah, he had done this, but it was because I was taking off with this guy. And so that made him snap, but actually the gun incident is what made me snap. The gun incident is what made me say, this guy is really violent, because it was after that I talked to Snow and told her what he had done. I had many instances where guns had been a problem, like that people I knew had died. When he put the gun to my head, that was my line in the sand. I might have been an extremely laid back young woman back then who didn't know her emotions, who didn't know how she felt, who didn't even know who she was. But I knew one thing. that gun incident was it. I mean, I had already reached a place where if I could find a way, I was going. And that's what he wasn't accepting. That stuff for opioids, that it was the first time he could wake up and not think about how to get high. And as I had said earlier, I was very naive to the drugs. It took me years to realize what the problem was. I knew all those years, 16 years, that there was an issue. It just never occurred to me that drugs could be the issue until my son was up in Alaska and was having that same issue, and he told my son that until they gave him that stuff for so let's take it back to my first son, or my middle son. He had just lost his dog. It had been a long, hard road for them, well over a year. The dog had broken his back. He was having all these health issues. He was losing body parts, and he had to come to the decision to put him down. So he had just put him down that day, and then I come over for my visit from, I live a couple thousand miles away, and I only get there once or twice a year, and I'm trying to make sure that it's 2 or 3 times a year. And this was the first time that he had been able to express his feelings about the stuff that had gone on when they were kids. I had heard a lot from the youngest son that, and it's all these years later, and I've moved past it. I've done a lot of healing. I've come to terms with my part in it. Up until then, I had taken all the responsibility because I left, and I had been raised a witness. This is what women do in the home, what wives do in the home, and part of it's generational. But it was really hard for me to hear another one of my kids be really angry with me, and I know how much they love me because it's actually very difficult for them to express that anger. And so full circle, he was also dealing with the way it had been presented to him. And I told him, very honestly, would I go back and talk to that young woman? Yes, I would, in the way I did it. But what he needed to understand is, would I still have left? Yes, I would have. I was right to leave. And that was the hardest part for him to hear. I was right to leave. I just wasn't right in how I handled it. But that young, uneducated, very ignorant young woman who had been raised that this is the position the woman took under her husband, who was suffocating and uneducated and didn't even know what job she could take, but would never leave her kids behind. To her, maybe there wasn't any other way.